Good evening, everyone. We're about to get the evening started, and I know it might seem really odd that I'm speaking on a mic and I can reach out and touch you all, but we're recording this evening, and so when we get to our Q&A session, I'll also ask you all if you have questions to speak from the mic as well. That's just so everyone's voices will be crisp and clear. So I want to start off by first introducing myself. My name is Alice Traore, and I'm the new Associate Director of the Multicultural Student Center. So this is my first event, so tonight is pretty special. They're going to do some adjustments with the lights right now so we can see Dr. Hussen's slides a little bit clearer, and so there'll be a little bit of activity going on behind me. When you all came in this evening, you noticed that there was a table up front that had a lot of exciting information listed, and it was there for the taking for you. So I'm hoping that before you leave this evening, if you didn't already, stop out by our info table and pick up the descriptions of our upcoming programs. You'll see a listing of everything that's happening from tonight through March. There are a series of workshops that are going on, and actually, I just want to talk you through them really briefly. So you may or may not have signed up for them tonight, but Dr. Hussen's talk is kicking off the series, the speakers and trainer series for this semester, and all of these programs are coming out of the IJET program, the Institute for Justice Education and Transformation. Every Thursday, you can look for something to come out of our shop. Next Thursday is Social Justice 101, and it will be facilitated by a couple of individuals from the MSC staff. This workshop will give you a basic understanding of social justice, and it will also build on to some of the workshops that are coming up in the near future. So if you're interested in taking things as a series, the Social Justice 101 is going to be a great one to start with. And so that's 6 o'clock in the Red Gym. That's going to be upstairs in the conference room. February 14th, we have a series that is the beginning of our series called the Active Allies series. And we're going to start off with the LGBTQ Allies training session, which will be facilitated by Gabe Javier, who's the director of the LGBT Center. That will start at 6 p.m. And again, that will be in the MSC conference room as well. We have a special series that's starting February 21st with a talk by two individuals. They come from Insight out of Milwaukee. We've got Chingyan Chin and Jessica Vega Gonzalez. Chingyan Chin actually was a co-author of The Revolution Starts at Home, and I was speaking to a group of our individuals, the interns with the MSC, and a lot of them are either have even read the book or are in the process of reading it or sharing the book with each other, so that brought up some excitement, so I'm hoping that you all will come out for that series. So their talk will be on February 1st at 7 to 9 p.m., and that will be in the MSC Lounge. Their daytime activities, it's a two-part series on February 21st. So the first part, this is part one, Transformative Justice Training. That will be at 4 o'clock through 5:30. It's part one, and we're hoping that those of you who sign up for that will come to part two, which is on February 22nd, and that's at 4 o'clock as well. All of these are pre-registration is necessary. There is a sign-in or sign-up process that's explained on our website, which we hope you take a look at. Our website's been revamped and it's gorgeous, but all the pre-registration is listed there. But individuals who sign up for Thursday are definitely eligible for the second piece on Friday, but you can't do the opposite. So make sure that if you come to Friday, you actually went through Thursday as well. February 28th will be another series of the Active Allies series, and this is the White Racial Justice Training. It'll be facilitated by Allie Brooks. And this workshop is for aspiring white allies on examining white privilege on movements plus skills building. And so these individuals will be working on some skills that are building facilitation for the future. That is from 6 to 8:30. All of this builds up to our symposium, which will be March 14th through the 15th in the Pyle Center, right next door. And our Race and Symposium, this will be our second series, is hosting a theme that's called Race and Place, Movement, Space, Land, and Power. On March 14th, another professor from here on campus, Monica White, will give a talk that's entitled Reclamation, Reconnection, and Resistance, Black Farmers, Food Security, and Justice. That's just the beginning of the symposium. March 15th starts at 9 and goes through 6. There's a host of sessions and speakers that are local and nationally known, and we hope that you get online to get more information about the series. You can also register online as well. Registration is free, and participation is free, rather. And we hope that you come and you spend 2 days with us, because it's going to be a dynamic 2 days. I want to move us into the reason why you're here for tonight's lecture, and I want to begin by telling you a little bit about Dr. Hussen. Aida Hussen is assistant professor of English at UWMadison, where she specializes in African American literature, feminist and queer theory, and trauma and effect studies. Prior to arriving at Madison, she trained at Harvard and Emory universities. She is currently working on a book about the concept of racial memory in contemporary Black fiction. Portions of this project have appeared in the journals African American Review and South Atlantic Quarterly. At UW, Aida teaches courses on 20th and 21st century African American literature, women's literature and feminist theory, queer theory, and the concept of memory. I'd like you all to make sure that your cell phones are silenced as you welcome Dr. Hussen to the stage.
Thank you, Alice, for the introduction. Thanks to Dante for the invitation to participate as part of the series, and thanks to all of you for making your way through the bitter cold to listen to my literary analysis. It's a rare group of people that you can find to do that. So if I'm ever in trouble, I know who to call. Can everyone hear me all right? I don't think I actually need a microphone, but I want to make sure that everything's registering. Okay, great. Okay, the title of my talk is Returning to Our Original Places: History, Fantasy, and the Contemporary African American Novel. And I'd like to begin my remarks today with a passage from a 1987 essay by the much acclaimed novelist Toni Morrison. In this essay, which she titles The Site of Memory, Morrison proposes that African American racial identification powerfully shapes the creative process, producing for the Black writer a unique sense of authorial duty to the past, to the community, and infusing Black creative work with a set of urgent and enduring desires. The desire, for example, for reparative reconstitution of a lost past, or for the redemption of Black historical suffering. To illustrate this theory of Black art as purposeful, historical, and communal, Morrison presents a metaphor that likens notions of race and place. So forgive this, oh dear. Forgive that. I'm unfortunately not very tech savvy, as I'm sure you'll discover over the course of this lecture. And one of my first technological misfortune is that I've somehow lost the picture that was here this morning, which was a picture of Toni Morrison. So picture Toni Morrison's face here alongside this photo of the Mississippi River and this quote which comes from her essay, The Site of Memory. We can read it together. She writes, "You know, they straightened out the Mississippi River in places to make room for houses and livable acreage. Occasionally, the river floods these places. Floods is the word they use, but in fact, it is not flooding, it is remembering where it used to be. All water has a perfect memory and is forever trying to get back to where it was. Writers are like that, remembering where we were, what valley we ran through, what the banks were like, the light that was there, and the route back to our original place. It is emotional memory, what the nerves and the skin remember, as well as how it appeared. And a rush of imagination is our flooding. As you can see, and I'll elaborate more upon this over the course of my talk, Morrison figures African American creative writing as a spatial return to what she calls our original place. Put another way, she imagines African American literature as being predicated upon an original displacement, a forcible, unnatural geographic shift, like the straightening out of the Mississippi, against which the Black authorly imagination rebels. Taking my cue from Morrison, I want to talk today about how, where, and why the contemporary African American literary imagination gravitates towards stories that are deeply imbricated with fantasies of original places. My focus here is not regional, which is to say, I'm not interested in today's talk, in tethering Black literary production to the rural South or the urban North, or to more recent phenomena of suburbanization. Rather, I'm interested in thinking about the ways in which our ideas of what it means to be modern Black Americans, as reflected in the literature of our time, are predicated on imaginings of distant places of lost origins, such as the Southern Plantation, Middle Passage, and Africa during or before the international slave trade. To be sure, these were historically real places, and with the exception of Middle Passage, they're places that have left searchable remains. We can tour a former plantation home or visit the ruins of the Ghanaian slave castles. But these are also places that are radically foreclosed to us by an unassailable temporal distance. That is, we cannot return to these places of origin in their moment of historical fatefulness, their moment of originality and origination. We cannot return to them to make a historical difference. This basic fact about the passage of time and the irrecoverable nature of history, of course, sits uneasily alongside Morrison's allegory, and a corroborating, well-known fact about contemporary African American literary production, namely that since the 1970s, Black writers have obsessively attempted to imagine precisely these kinds of impossible returns through time and space. In these works, some of which I've listed here, just to give you a small taste of the range and scope and magnitude of this subgenre, authors override realistic impediments to returning to our original places through such supernatural technologies as time travel, haunting, possession, stigmata, and the discovery of death-defying African cosmologies. There are also some more conventional works of historical realism, but these are in fact the minority of recent African American writing about racial remembrance. Indeed, the Black literary obsession with the idea of the racial return has been so pronounced that the literary critic Keith Byerman announced in 2005 that historical fiction had become the dominant mode of African American literature. And to my knowledge, no critic since has contested this claim. My talk today addresses this tension, then, between the pastness of the past on one hand and the persistent desire for its recuperation and redemption on the other. My argument will be that what fantasies about places of racial origin reveal to us is not so much the past as it was, as the contours of our contemporary desire for a lost past. Stated in axiomatic form, fantasies are less about what they purport to describe than they are about motivating feelings of lack, loss, or deprivation. So here's a sort of mundane allegory. If I'm fantasizing about a piece of cake, that fantasy is less likely about the wonderful properties of cake itself than about the fact that I feel hunger or that I've deprived myself of cake that week, right? Which incidentally I haven't. I had cake yesterday. Now, I don't mean to trivialize my subject matter here, only to clarify the guiding claim of my talk, which will be that fantasies of historical places of racial origins work, sometimes against their stated objectives, to reveal to us the coordinates of contemporary Black psychic life. My remarks are organized into 3 parts, and in the interest of coherence, I'll offer a quick overview at the outset. First, I'll turn to some textual examples to give you a sense of some ways in which Black historical fiction has imagined the racial past. Here I'll show that most often, the site of return has been represented as a geographical destination of the plantation or the slave ship. But I will also contend that contemporary depictions of these past places are discernibly infused with present-day desires. So in other words, the novelistic destination is not the plantation or the slave ship proper, but the present-day fantasy of the plantation or the slave ship. Further, I'll propose that the slippage between real and imaginary original places is suggestive of 2 particular fantasies that are common to contemporary African American life. One, a fantasy of intergenerationally continuous historical purpose, which I'll call the fantasy of historical relevance. And second, a fantasy of the power to redeem historical suffering, which I'll call the fantasy of historical potency. Finally, expanding upon my close readings, I'll propose a working theory about why what Morrison conceptualizes as the tidal pull of our original places is so acutely felt in the contemporary moment. In other words, guided by the geographies of literary fantasy, I'll attempt to answer the question, why historical fiction now? One can somewhat predictably imagine 3 distinct geographies of African American origins. One, the southern plantation, where Africans became African Americans, and thus where African American identity as such began. 2, Middle Passage, the scene of African unmaking that presaged reconsolidations of identity as African American. And 3, Africa, the historical site of Blackness before diaspora. Drawing upon a few texts from the partial bibliography that I posted a moment ago, I want to flesh out our sense of what it might mean to feel the pull of these places, the plantation, the Atlantic, Africa, although I'm actually going to bracket Africa for a moment in today's talk, in contemporary American life. But in doing so, I also wish to trouble an uncomplicated understanding of these places as, well, places. You see, when Morrison talks about African American writers' compulsion to return to our original places, she's talking about an imaginary return. It is the imagination that floods over, defies the bounds of time, and attempts to recapture a picture or a story of what it was like then and there. Put another way, contemporary narratives of slavery are fantasies of the past, whose geographies, while often, if not always, based in research, are animated or brought to life by creative minds in the present day. So I want to ask, in addition to the foundational question of why these places and what accounts for their pull, what is the relationship between the retrospective fantasy of place and the place as it was? Let's turn to a specific text to make these queries feel a bit more concrete. Has anyone here read Octavia Butler's time travel novel, Kindred? A couple, okay. So I'll offer a bit of plot summary to sort of bring the rest of us up to speed. Octavia Butler's novel Kindred is a book in which a contemporary Black protagonist is pulled back in time to a site of familial and by extension racial origins, figured as a 19th century Maryland plantation. The main character is Dana Franklin, an aspiring writer whom we encounter in 1976, shortly after she's married a fellow writer, a white man named Kevin. The narrative action begins when Dana is seized, literally, by an inexplicable supernatural force that pulls her out of the present and transports her back in time and across the country to a Maryland slave plantation inhabited by her ancestors. Over the course of the novel, Dana involuntarily taxis between her new marital home in Los Angeles, which we might think of as her home of choice, and the plantation, which we might think of as her ancestral home, and certainly an unchosen one at that. I want to begin our discussion of the plantation as a site of origins in contemporary Black fiction by looking at a particular line from Kindred that I'll contextualize and then read to you. In this passage, which appears about 3/4 of the way through the book, Dana describes her feelings about the plantation as follows. This is the first quote on the slide. "I've got no love at all for that place, but so help me. When I saw it again, it was so much like coming home that it scared me." This is, for a variety of reasons, an unusual sentence to put in the mouth of a late 20th century Black woman from the urban West Coast. Perhaps most conspicuously, this sentence surprises us because of its dissonance with the cultural, temporal, and geographical dissimilarities between Dana's actual home in California and the antebellum plantation that her ancestors inhabited in Maryland, right? These are not, to all appearances, like objects. In addition, I'd like to point out that Dana's comparison, that is, her description of the antebellum plantation as like home, unsettles because of its patent dissimilarity from historical representations of antebellum plantation life as it has been described by formerly enslaved African Americans. So one reason why this is an odd thing for Dana to say is because contemporary Los Angeles is in fact very dissimilar from plantation life in Maryland in the 19th century. But another reason is because her articulation of her relationship to the plantation is in fact radically different from how formerly enslaved African Americans described the plantation in their own time. In the historical literature from the 16th to 19th centuries, African American texts have represented the plantation as a site of negative identification. It is a place of unpredictable violence and radical unsafety, against which enslaved Blacks struggle to conceptualize coherent and viable senses of identity and worth. Time and again, in traditional slave narratives, the plantation is the place where Black identity is suppressed, or in some cases even made impossible. It is escape from the plantation, or at least recognition of the desire to escape, that marks the beginning of Black self-determination. In leaving the plantation, one rejects the object status of slave and begins to craft a social identity. But in Kindred, we see something different. Here, it's the return to the plantation rather than the departure from it that allows Dana to flesh out her sense of self, or to know herself more fully. It is the journey to the plantation rather than the elected departure from it that feels like a homecoming, that promises recognition of Dana's authentic self. Indeed, as the novel progresses, the place that I've called her home of choice, that is 1976 Los Angeles, comes to feel increasingly irrelevant, or at least inauthentic to Dana. 2 months into her time travel experiences, she tells us, quote, here's the second quote, I had been home to 1976, to this house, and it hadn't felt that home-like. It didn't now. The time, the year was right, but the house just wasn't familiar enough. By contrast, she describes the antebellum plantation as a site of, quote, a stark, powerful reality that the gentle conveniences and luxuries of this house, of now, could not touch. How should we interpret Dana's peculiar embrace of her site of ancestral suffering as home? Certainly, Butler is not proposing that African Americans would welcome a return to the system of plantation slavery as a homecoming, nor should I be clear, does Dana enjoy her involuntary return in any easy sense of the word, enjoy. But there is for Dana something alluring about the plantation, something that seems to pull her backward against the force of African American literature's expected progression from past to future and from slavery to freedom. What if we imagined, against the grain of the story that she tells, that Dana has mistaken her own desire to know and to redeem the past for the pull or desire of history itself? In other words, is it possible that what Dana interprets as an ancestral demand for her return is in fact an effect of her own 20th century longing for historical relevance or meaning? That it is not history that longs for her and pulls her toward it, but she who wishes to be recognized by and in relation to history. As an orphan disowned by her custodial aunt and uncle upon her marriage to a white man, living in an integrated California where her experiences of racism occur primarily in the form of microaggressions, Dana's life is, in literal and symbolic ways, disjointed from her racial and familial lineage, and only obliquely tied to political narratives of civil rights struggle that provided a consolidated sense of African American interests and identity from slavery through the civil rights movement of the 20th century. Approaching this thesis from another angle, we might say that Dana's life manifests both the gains and losses of the mid-century civil rights movement. Even as she gains civic status, personal and professional opportunity, mobility, and a sense of individual agency, one might contend that she has lost the racial legacy of yearning for freedom that had collectivized and characterized African American political communities for centuries. Situated historically and socially beyond that tradition, that is, as a post-civil rights Black woman living in the age, and at least in the popular imagination in the state, California, of integration, Dana loses access to a compelling narrative about how and why her life matters within a grander scheme of racial and national history. In this light, we can see the return to the plantation as an attempt to recapture the spark of historical purpose, or as Dana puts it, quote, to ensure my family's survival. To recap then, we might respond to the question, why the plantation, by identifying the plantation as the site against which African American political and identitarian struggle has historically been defined. Butler identifies a kind of contemporary waywardness in her orphaned temp worker and itinerant writer protagonist, something like what the historian Manning Marable has metaphorically described as African Americans' political and cultural sense of being, quote, lost in the wilderness following the political assassinations of the 50s and 60s. What I'm suggesting here is that Butler identifies and attempts to reroute this lostness through a historical reminder. The past summons Dana to remind her of where she came from, and to implicate her in a continuous story of familial and racial progress. But here's the twist. In fantasizing about the possibility of a historical reminder that would set African American communities back on a course of political progress, part of Butler's wish is in fact to reverse the direction of desire, to imagine a history that calls out to us rather than acknowledging our own unappeased longing for historical relevance. If we grant that history does not, and indeed cannot, call us, that it passed before us and without knowledge that we would ever be, then we must also explore the possibility that the original places that Morrison spoke so powerfully of are in fact not places in a prior time that we can return to as they were, but fantasies of the past directed by and imbued with the political and identitarian desires of the present. To be clear, my point is not that history leaves no mark on the present, or that we cannot learn about the past in meaningful and true ways. More modestly, I mean to argue, first, that firsthand knowledge of the past is foreclosed to us. Second, that the fantasy of returning to the past, as Butler's Dana does, to experience a sense of historical continuity and relevance, is a manifestation of our desire, not of history's desire for us. And third, resultantly, that the places conjured in contemporary fantasies of historical return are critically different from our actual places of origin. Even when contemporary writers ground their historical novels in meticulous research, there is a key disjuncture between place as it was and place as a symbolic repository of a lost past. These claims, I hope, will become more clear as we turn to another example of a literary representation of racial origins. Specifically, I turn now to Morrison's Beloved, the text that contains what's likely the best-known literary representation of the transatlantic migration of captive African slaves. If you've read the book, as I suspect a number of you have, your initial thought may be that while present, the book's scene of Middle Passage is in many ways set apart from, if not subordinated to, the novel's major narrative arc. After all, this scene takes up only 5 of the book's 325 pages, and it makes only fleeting and encrypted reference to the novel's protagonist. Nevertheless, I maintain that these 5 pages are essential to understanding the book as a whole, particularly insofar as they provide a scene of origins, which in turn functions as an interpretive key for understanding the mystical title character and the kinds of desires that she expresses and elicits. My argument in brief will be that if Kindred is a novel about contemporary African American fantasies of historical relevance, projected onto the fantasy of an alluring plantation home, then Beloved is a novel whose fantasy of Middle Passage's demanding ghosts emerges from a contemporary desire to resist feelings of historical impotence, of retroactive powerlessness in the face of historical atrocity. As I said, I'll focus primarily on Morrison's depiction of Middle Passage, but before turning to the scene, a few words of plot summary might be helpful. Beloved is a work of historical fiction loosely based on a 19th century fugitive slave named Margaret Garner. After escaping a southern plantation and fleeing to Ohio, Garner was pursued and cornered by slave catchers under the fugitive slave law. Rather than see her children return to slavery, she murdered one and attempted to murder them all. In Beloved, Garner is recast as Morrison's protagonist, Sethe, and the ghost of the murdered child returns to lay claim to her mother. As the novel progresses, we learn that Beloved, as the ghost is called, is not only the ghost of Sethe's sacrificed baby. She is a communal ghost whose single body aggregates the infinite suffering endured by African Americans under slavery. So, for example, while Sethe sees her lost daughter in Beloved, another member of the community sees an enslaved woman who was raised as a sex slave before being savagely murdered and discarded in a river. And in the passage that I want to focus on today, we find that Beloved carries personal memories of Middle Passage. And as a side note, if some of you have seen the movie but not read the book, you'll know that in the movie, Beloved is solely the ghost of Sethe's daughter. It's a sort of interpretation that elides the book's complexity, in which Beloved is a stand-in for African Americans' collective memories of trauma and loss. In the context of the novel, then, the scene of Middle Passage is treated as the ghost's first memory. That is, the scene that I'm about to share with you is Morrison's fictional depiction of the original places and the original wounds of African Americans as a collective community. Because this moment in the text is formally unconventional, I've reproduced it on this slide to preserve its intended effects. At this moment in the text, which is about 235 pages into a 325-page book, We abruptly break from the third-person narration and normative prose style, that is, grammatically recognizable sentences with easily identifiable reference, to a first-person, fragmented, poetic style that evades easy understanding. Here, we also transition from a story about Sethe, with a discernible plot that moves from exposition to climax, anticipating resolution, as stories do, to a series of first-person addresses that defy the expected trajectory of a story. They resist not only resolution, but also linearity, a sense of sequence, a surety of direction. Put simply, what I'm saying is that this is the moment in the text where the story breaks down. It turns into fragments. It spirals around nameless characters. Its sentences include nonsensical and contradictory utterances. Morrison writes, "I am beloved and she is mine. I see her take flowers away from leaves. She puts them in a round basket. The leaves are not for her. She fills the basket. She opens the grass. I would help her, but the clouds are in the way. How can I say things that are pictures? I am not separate from her. There is no place where I stop. Her face is my own, and I want to be there in the place where her face is, and to be looking at it too, a hot thing. All of it is now. It is always now. There will never be a time when I am not crouching and watching others who are crouching too. I am always crouching. The man on my face is dead. His face is not mine. His mouth smells sweet, but his eyes are locked. Some who eat nasty themselves. I do not eat. The men without skin bring us their morning water to drink. We have none. At night I cannot see the dead man on my face. Daylight comes through the cracks, and I can see his locked eyes. I am not big. Small rats do not wait for us to sleep. Someone is thrashing, but there is no room to do it in. If we had more to drink, we could make tears. We cannot make sweat or morning water. So the men without skin bring us theirs. One time they bring us sweet rocks to suck. We are all trying to leave our bodies behind. The man on my face has done it. It is hard to make yourself die forever. You sleep short, then return. In the beginning we could vomit. Now we do not." This is a notoriously cryptic passage. And indeed, some critics have gone so far to argue that what's most significant about this representation of middle passage is its unreadability, its resistance to coherent and accessible meaning. In a way, I'll make a similar claim about how Morrison uses language to demonstrate the difficulty, if not the impossibility, of communicating trauma. But I'm convinced that there's a good deal in this passage that begs to be read, that invites literary exegesis. And so if you permit me, I'd like to initially bracket the first stanza and begin with an analysis of the latter two stanzas, which most explicitly and evocatively describe the conditions of the hold of a slave ship. I'll start with some thoughts about how place operates here, and then pulling in the first stanza, I'll consider how Morrison represents the workings of identification, empathy, and desire. And this in turn will lead us back to a consideration of contemporary racial fantasy and its appropriations of the historical. So let's begin with place. In the second and third stanzas of the passage that I've reproduced for you here, Morrison simultaneously describes a place that is palpable, which is to say, a place that asserts its realness by forcing us to feel it, and one that is incomprehensible, by which I mean it cannot be located. Reading this portion of the text, we are made to sense the narrator's surroundings, crowded, smelly, suffused with body heat. But at the same time, Morrison gives us no proper names or spatial coordinates through which to know this place that she depicts in such heady sensory detail. For captive slaves, Morrison seems to suggest, the place of middle passage was not the sea, but the body. And not the body as the contemporary reader knows or experiences it, but the body voided of social meaning, removed from cultural context. The body as a physical trap that degrades, hurts, and humiliates. The structure and content of Morrison's non-sentences mimic this vision, producing not a cohesive story of transatlantic voyage, but a series of unpunctuated shocks, strung together to form the demoralizing pronouncement of horror's eternity. It is always now. Let me reiterate and further clarify a particular point about the concepts of place and embodiment that are operating in this passage. At first glance, it may seem that Morrison's transposition of the place of middle passage from the scale of world geography to that of the body would better allow us to access or know the suffering of the enslaved. After all, bodies are in some sense universal. We all have one. We have all experienced bodily discomfort, such that if someone says they've fallen or that they have a cold, we can empathically conjure an imagined sense of what that person feels like. In the casual idiom, we can put ourselves in their place. But in fact, in these two stanzas, Morrison's representation of the body and bodily suffering operate in a very different way. Here, in Beloved's barracks, the bodies of the enslaved are discreetly bounded, or in her word, locked. Even when she looks into the face of a man whose helpless captivity mirrors her own, the narrator says bleakly, "His face is not mine, and his eyes are locked." Put another way, an essential component of being in the body, or being embodied, that Morrison describes here, is the loneliness and confinement that our bodies bring us, the sense that we are ultimately different and alone among others. Each of us a particular transient bundle of sensation and consciousness that flickers in time but then dies, locking out the world that survives us. That our bodies can be isolating or individuating is, of course, a universal fact. So one might easily say, I, like the speaker of this address, have felt small and vulnerable and set apart from others, and all of us will die alone. But to insist above all else on this kind of sympathetic identification would be to overlook Morrison's insistent depiction of middle passage as a historically unique and aggressively antisocial milieu. The places of middle passage that she shows us, the congested, economically organized barracks that defied all cultural norms of privacy and intimacy, the abjected bodies forced to consume urine for sustenance. Surely these are places and positions beyond the range of our empathic imaginations. They are places that are inimical to any cultural conception of what it means to be human. What I'm contending here is that Morrison represents the suffering of enslaved captives as they traverse the Atlantic as fundamentally unknowable to one another, perhaps to themselves, certainly to us at this historical and cultural distance, insofar as knowledge presumes a context of sociality that was eviscerated aboard the slave ships. For clarity, let me rephrase and repeat. There were real historical places that made up the routes of middle passage that captive Africans traversed en masse. But these places existed outside the terms of recognizable social life. Experiences on board the slave ships defied familiar social rules of categorization, order, and decency. And by doing so, they likely made the captives seem unfamiliar to themselves and to others. Thus, the dead man perched on the lyric persona's face is not described in any social terms. He's not a person with an occupation or a family or a set of beliefs, but a dead body made up of basic shapes and colors, like the glistening points of his white teeth. So what I'm saying here is that trauma not only sets us apart from others, but also it sets us apart from the very terms of the social through which others might recognize or know us. And if the lives of the enslaved were unknowable to their contemporaries, then surely they remain unknowable to their descendants, centuries removed. Much as Morrison's lyric persona cannot claim her neighbor's face as her own, his face is not mine, she says, we in the present cannot return to places of ancestral wounding to know or claim or repair the lives of the dead. This cold fact that history is irreversible and even irrecoverable is in a profound sense the bedrock of the novel Beloved. But the novel's narrative action consists not in proof of this truth, but in the fantasy of opposite desires. As we've seen in our reading of the two stanzas about Middle Passage, Beloved assumes that history is in some real and powerful way foreclosed to us. And yet the book is about the desire that this not be so. To demonstrate this point, I want to return now to the first stanza, which we had originally bracketed, a stanza that fantasizes transcendence of the isolating horrors of Middle Passage that it goes on to describe. So let's read this first stanza once more. I am beloved and she is mine. I see her take flowers away from leaves. She puts them in a round basket. The leaves are not for her. She fills the basket. She opens the grass. I would help her, but the clouds are in the way. How can I say things that are pictures? I am not separate from her. There is no place where I stop. Her face is my own, and I want to be there in the place where her face is and to be looking at it too. A hot thing. Here, as in the stanzas we've already reviewed, Morrison dramatizes the notion that the antisocial environs of Middle Passage defy knowledge or coherent articulation. How can I say things that are pictures? She wishes the lyric persona wishes to help or to interrupt the scene, to intervene in the unfolding of historical horror and individual suffering. But she is impeded from doing so by way of her visceral separation from the bodies of others. I would help her, but the clouds are in the way. Thus far, this stanza seems largely similar to those that follow. But here's the dramatic difference. Over and against her awareness of a fixed and certain separation, a separation of both time and place, the lyric persona boldly names her impossible desire, her desire to embrace history's victims, to name and claim them. I am not separate from her. There is no place where I stop. Her face is my own, and I want to be there. This assertion of sameness or identification is, of course, immediately contradicted by the historical vision that follows it. We read in one moment, her face is my own, and in the next, his face is not mine. So how can both of these things be true? In the context of the novel, they are made true by the workings of a supernatural force that remakes meaning-defying suffering in the image of a resilient, death-defying ghost. The ghost, who's called Beloved, summons all of history's abject under the cover of her name. She aggregates their desires to be recognized, to be beloved, and she presents them to the living. Without traveling any further down the rabbit hole of the novel's plot, which is eternally complex, what I mean to propose here, much as with Kindred, is that in Beloved, the ghost that purports to carry her own urgent hunger for recognition and redemption is in fact the vehicle of our contemporary longings to lessen the damage of the past. Put another way, the past is not calling out to us, and against the claim of the novel, it is not always the time of historical suffering. But when we in the present think of historical suffering, we long to imagine not masses dead and dying at sea, but a stubbornly enduring ghost child, quote, waiting to be loved and cry shame. This is the desire, impossible yet enduring, that Beloved illuminates. And the success and influence of the novel, we might imagine, attest to the widespread resonance of this particular fantasy of racial origins. Now, I realize that my time is limited, and so I want to begin to move in the direction of a conclusion. But let me first as succinctly as I can, recap the territory that we've covered thus far. I've suggested that contemporary African American novels have been overwhelmingly characterized by historical fantasies of racial origin, attaching in particular to the sites of the plantation and Middle Passage. I've proposed that these fantasies take shape in two primary forms, which I have identified as the fantasy of historical relevance and the fantasy of historical potency. And I've suggested that these particular fantasies of wanting to mean and wanting to matter are likely related to a pervasive mood of political despair that has characterized African American communities since the decline of the civil rights and Black liberation movements of the mid-20th century. Let's bracket for a moment the challenge that Obama made, particularly in 2008, and if you'd like to, we can certainly circle back to that in the Q&A. I'd like to close by extending these relatively small claims in the service of a more ambitious hypothesis. That is, using the literary analysis I've performed thus far as a set of clues, I'd like to venture a generic explanatory narrative that would contextualize the current literary obsession with our original places in relation to the long history and diaspora of African American identity. This narrative, the explanatory narrative, that will lead us to a response to the question of why historical fiction now, begins with the claim that a collective historical account of African American identity might be told in relation to two momentous points of traumatic rupture, in which the second breakage point, what I've described in relation to Kindred and Beloved as a kind of postmodern crisis in faith, reframes the original severance of diaspora as unresolved and indeed as demanding. As Morrison describes it, as exerting a tidal force upon contemporary Black consciousness. The facts of this narrative history are obvious and familiar. It begins with Middle Passage and diaspora, spans the constitution of African American identity in the plantations of the New World, and proceeds through emancipation and the various civil rights movements of the late 19th and 20th centuries. The thing I offer that's new with this story is an interpretive dimension which tacitly builds upon trauma theory to imagine why and how the post-civil rights literary imagination has recurrently turned backwards, seeking out an original place. It is an outrageous statement of the obvious to say that Middle Passage must have been traumatic. But when I begin with this statement, I mean it not only in the colloquial sense, which is to say that it must have been frightening, life-changing, utterly unnerving, but also in a stricter clinical sense. Trauma as a psychological concept consists in the radical disruption. Trauma as a psychological concept consists in the radical disruption to the narrative unity of life. It means in the most basic terms that one can no longer tell a coherent story about him or herself. Surely this is an apt description of the crisis of diaspora. Packed as cargo to be sold as commodities, enslaved Africans were suddenly, and in many cases totally, severed from their familiar systems of cultural, genetic, linguistic, symbolic, and spiritual community that had once given their lives meaning and coherence. Whereas Middle Passage figures as a traumatic moment of origins, a point at which the stories of African lives are interrupted and rendered nonsensical or irrelevant, the forging of African American identity in the New World figures as a therapeutic or healing measure, an effort to assimilate crisis into a forward-moving story of self and survival. These reparative collective self-stories, through which African American identity as such was articulated and consolidated, began paradoxically and via fantasy under the dehumanizing conditions of slavery. As a result, they have most often coalesced around the desire for and pursuit of racial freedom. A number of historians, as well as literary and cultural critics, have described this reparative self-story that emerged from conditions of captivity and enslavement as the foundational premise of African American identity. For example, the late historian Manning Marable describes an intergenerationally continuous story of, quote, yearning to be free that takes root on America's plantations and slave society and persists as a unifying collective African American self-story through the late 1960s, end quote. Similarly, the literary and cultural critic Robert B. Steptoe contends that the progressive story about collective Black movement from enslavement to freedom is not simply a story within the lexicon of African American identity, but the foundational story, or to borrow his term, the pre-generic myth, around which ideas and ideals of Western Blackness cohere. So far, I've described the first two steps here, right? An original rupture that consists in middle passage, and a process of repair, which consists in the formation of African American identity through a collectivizing, inspiriting fantasy about redemptive freedom. But as I forewarned, my story is bookended by another point of rupture. This rupture, which I trace with Marable to the late 60s and 70s, consists in a crisis of belief that manifests on several levels. It is a crisis of belief about the possibility of African American freedom. It is a crisis of belief in the idea of progressive history, a history that, to borrow a phrase from Dr. King, arcs toward justice. And it is a crisis of belief in both Africa and America as sites of imminent Black freedom. In delineating this second rupture, I don't mean to suggest that the late 20th century was the first time that African Americans had expressed cynicism or disillusionment about America, freedom, or the possibility of historical redemption. Such a claim, of course, would be wildly false. But I do mean to suggest that the anticlimactic decline of the civil rights and Black power movements, marked by assassinations, battle fatigue, and corporate and political co-optation, brought about widespread cultural disillusionment that was unprecedented in its reach and fortitude. Marable traces this turn in Black political sentiment, more specifically, to the 1968 assassination of Dr. King. Identifying King as a final prophet of, quote, a cultural tradition of salvation and liberation, Marable contends that King's assassination, together with the violent and often treacherous opposition to Black liberation movements that characterized the 1970s, ushered in an era of profound political disorientation and despair. If the progressive freedom quest was once, quote, affirmed with Talmudic certainty, Marable writes, then by the final decades of the 20th century, it, quote, began to be perceived as strangely anachronistic and even counterproductive, end quote. The post-civil rights decades, according to Marable's model, represent a new era in African American political culture in which the priority of the racial freedom quest is radically called into question. The second rupture that I'm describing, then, consists in the failure of the reparative narrative of the freedom quest to reach fruition, or even more modestly, to continue to hold out hope. And it is this felt failure that urges us to return to and to question the meaning of the original scene of displacement and disorientation. Remember, for centuries, the freedom quest functioned as the story that assimilated and promised to heal the trauma of diaspora. The dissolution of this cultural narrative, then, necessarily reopens the original wound of enslavement and dislocation. We might think of this second rupture as a kind of unhealing by which an old injury is re-aggravated and re-exposed. Of course, and as I have been trying to argue, the metaphor of the wound is to some degree misleading, for there is no enduring, death-defying Black body or mind that bears on her consolidated form the history of trauma, repair, and re-aggravation that I've cursorily sketched here. This, like the idea of our original places rearing up to reclaim us, is a fantasy of impossible reconciliation, of a centuries-old wounded body whose sores can still be tended. It is important, I have proposed, to know the difference between history, or the world, as it is, and history, or the world, as we fantasize it. But I hope I have been clear that this distinction is not important because fantasy must be discredited. Rather, it's important to make this distinction in order to clarify the terms of fantasy and desire. For how else, other than through fantasies of wholeness, return, and repair, fantasies that stem from what we do not have or indeed what we cannot be. How else can we begin to understand the terms, the import, and the power of our contemporary desire? So those are my remarks. And I'm happy to move into discussion of, thank you. I'm happy to move into discussion if there are points that you'd like to, for me to further clarify, or other related issues that you'd like to take on as a group.
Okay. So at this time, we're going to take questions. I can pass the microphone to anyone who would like to come up and ask Dr. Hussen a question, and I'm going to time it we can go on for half an hour or however long y'all all like. So just, who would like to ask the first question? Anyone? Yes, okay.
First of all, thank you, Dr. Hussen, for speaking tonight.
Please call me Aida.
Aida, very well. I guess the question I have is, I'm thinking about a lecture I recently heard, and embarrassingly enough, I don't remember the speaker, but they talked about this this problem of an unresolved botched emancipation in the American psyche, and this idea that it just goes really unacknowledged, or sort of it's been unresolved, this issue of the emancipation being essentially, botched and never followed through, and reparations never occurring, no reconciliation. And so I'm wondering, like, if you can make some sort of, I guess, connection between this idea of a secondary rupture at the time of the late 60s, 70s, and that idea of a botched emancipation.
Right. So in some ways, we might argue from a historical perspective that what I'm calling the secondary rupture is, in fact, a third or tertiary rupture, right? And in such a narrative, the secondary rupture would happen after Reconstruction with what the Southerners call redemption in sort of really problematic ways, right? But with sort of the quashing of the sort of revolutionary and justice-oriented hopes of Reconstruction and certain strains of participation in the Civil War, right? I think that would work relatively seamlessly within the narrative. It would just be sort of a more historically nuanced one, right? The story that I'm trying to tell is one that's necessarily abbreviated because of the areas in which I want to emphasize the relationship between sort of historical event and political mood on one hand, and literary and cultural production on the other hand. So certainly I've neglected a number of other historical phenomena that have happened between Middle Passage and the moment at which the historical novel comes to dominate African American literature. And I think it's absolutely worthwhile for you to reconstruct my narrative in these kinds of revisionary ways. So, thanks.
Hi, Aida.
Hi.
I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about the difference between remembering when it comes to the storyteller and the viewer, and just thinking about how you started off with a Toni Morrison quote and then got into Beloved. It kind of seems that this is very much centered on how the storyteller wants us to remember, but I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about how there may be a difference between storyteller and viewer, and where I am at least thinking about this particularly is in the context of Django Unchained, and how we may have a white person who tells a black person's fantasy or remembering, and if that makes a difference. I'm all over the place, and there are other places I am, but I'm not gonna say any more to confuse you or anyone else. But
I'm trying to orient myself. I have to I have to start my response with the confession that I haven't seen Django Unchained, and I realize that it's a film that I'm going to have to see because I study contemporary narratives of slavery, but I have a visceral aversion to Quentin Tarantino that I have yet to surmount. So I have some sense of the movie because I've read some reviews of it, and as I understand it, your question is perhaps less about that text in particular than it is about how we determine who has the authority to tell stories of racial remembrance. Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting question, and one that the authors of contemporary narratives of slavery, even if we view them as a sort of racially homogenous group, which they're not, right? A number of white people have written contemporary narratives of slavery, but even if we look only at the African Americanists, or at the African Americans, there's a good deal of contention about what kinds of stories are appropriate to tell and what kinds of stories can lay claim to authenticity or to memorial truth, right? So I'm thinking, for example, about how we might juxtapose a novel like Toni Morrison's Beloved, which on one hand is a magical realist text, right? We're not actually being asked to believe in the existence of ghosts, right? But on the other hand, it's also, it's a magical realist text, right? It's not just magical. And we are being asked to believe in something like collective memory, right? We see something very different in a book like Charles Johnson's Oxherding Tale, which is a less commercially successful novel, in large part because it's deemed generically inappropriate by many people, right? So Charles Johnson is a National Book Award winning African-American author, but he's also an author who, in many of his texts, works against the grain of the African-American literary tradition. So Oxherding Tale is a comedy about slavery. And this in and of itself is sort of a premise that many people find objectionable. Johnson's book is in fact not irreverent in the ways that I understand Django Unchained to be. And as I said, that's an uninformed statement. But I think it's interesting to see the ways in which we as a contemporary audience, at a sort of necessary and indisputable remove from actual firsthand memory, are asked to evaluate the sort of phantasmatic memories of authors on the basis of a kind of political morality, right? So it seems like certain kinds of memories are right or true or authentic because they subscribe to a politics that is appealing or progressive, while others rebel against our sense of rightful or respectful memory, in large part because they rebel against our own contemporary sense of how we'd like to imagine race, politics, desire, and so forth. So I'm not really responding to your question, but hopefully my talking around it has in some way been of interest.
Completely fine. Like I said, I'm all over too. So.
I am interested in terms of Django Unchained in the idea of the revenge fantasy, and that's one thing that sort of makes me curious to venture to the movie theater, but I'm not sure that it's Tarantino's revenge fantasy that I want to see. So.
Good evening, Aida.
Hi.
Thanks again for coming out and doing this. I think it was wonderful. If I was the only one here, I'd be really, really happy and excited. But I'm not going to quite let you off your Django Unchained question yet. But actually, I'm just going to use it as a jumping off point to talk about one of the questions I think I heard in your question embedded there was, when we talk about these returns as a manifestation of desire, and then my question is, whose desire? Is it a cultural desire that that person, that author, that storyteller is a reflection of, or is it a more individuated desire of that individual? So how much as who is the storyteller impacts the desire that gets manifested in the narrative? So 2 examples, Beloved, the novel by Toni Morrison, and Beloved, the film, directed by Jonathan Demme.
Right.
Very different stories.
Yes.
Why? What is the there's different desire. If you ask me, I think there are different
Right.
desires at work in the
Right.
narrative of storytelling, as opposed to Color Purple, Alice Walker, Color Purple
Steven
film,
Spielberg, right.
Lord, why am I?
Steven Spielberg,
Steven Spielberg,
right.
right? So I'm
Right.
wondering, as you're working through this,
Yeah.
is there something that shows up about whose desires at work? Is that desire racialized? Is it very individuated? Is it I mean, I kind of hear a notion about it's cultural, right? This desire, but I also think there's something important in what you were getting at. Is there something individuated about who culturally is the storyteller?
Right, and I think that I think part of the sort of evasive answer would be that part of it's about translation from the complexity of text to the sort of limited space of film, and that how could you really make all of Beloved into a film? But I'm not sure that's the full answer, right? And I think that the question that you're getting about what Jonathan Demme's sort of historical desire might be is a helpful one. I think it's also interesting, I don't know if you've read any of the interviews that were done with Oprah about Beloved. When she describes Sethe, for example, and her relationship to Sethe as a contemporary African-American woman, her articulations about her relationship to the past are, in fact, radically different from Toni Morrison's in ways that make you question whether she understood the role that she was supposed to be playing. So I'm not sure that it's necessarily a matter of some sort of essentialist idea of racial memory that we all share, like because it sort of pulls us back like the tides of the Mississippi or what have you. But I do think that there's something to be said about a commonality between many African American authors of contemporary narratives of slavery who are interested in articulating a feeling of lack or dissatisfaction around the desire for historical redemption on one hand, and a number of white filmmakers, and we can think about Spielberg not only in terms of The Color Purple, but also with like Amistad, right, who are interested in telling these heroic redemptive narratives that become about sort of glory and our capacity to be proud of ourselves as Americans, right? And these are sort of in self-evident ways really different ways to long for tellings of the past, and different ways of conceptualizing our desires for historical meaning.
I have a question.
Sure.
So, okay, I'm all over the place too. Let me try to word this correctly. So, like, there's, of course, like, as you said in your lecture, there have been a lot of films and books and a lot of things done on slavery, but yet I feel like we're still having this same conversation, like, year after year. Like, and it's, it's not necessarily, like, they're not always progressive conversations. I just feel like they're always the same conversations, like, keep, like, going around the actual issue, and, like, and I know it's, like, a combination of things, like, not being properly educated on it, and, all these things, and then, a lot of times Hollywood glamorizing the story of slavery and things, and trauma theory is just so fascinating to me because it's actually putting us back in the place, so where we can actually feel what's going on rather than just read text or watch a movie. And do you think that that's what's going to get us to finally, like, actually truly be educated on, like, what really, because I know we don't really know how we can't literally put ourselves back in that place. Like, all we can do is explore trauma theory, really. And do you think that's, like, the answer to finally getting us to see what happened? Or, like, because even with Django, I know some people, like, Django was a problem for a lot of audience members because if you don't really know the history of slavery, it further perpetuates, like, those stereotypes and, all those things. So I don't know. I know I'm all over the place, but
Can I ask you a little bit of a follow-up question, just to sort of fine-tune where I should go with this? When you talk about having the same conversations about slavery over and over again, what do you see as the contours of those conversations?
Like, I know in high school or, like, middle school, it was always like, okay, slavery happened, like, Africans were taken, Middle Passage, okay, ended up in the South, picked cotton, freedom, like it was just like always like it's just always that. And like I don't know, I just feel like that's always it. And like that's all we know. Like I just feel like that's all we only know the basics, and that's all we really talk about. And even in Django, I know what Django's purpose wasn't to educate people on slavery. I know that was like like I know that wasn't Tarantino's intention. I know it was to make a good film, you know, like I know that's what it was. But like even if you just don't know the history of slavery, you look at Samuel L. Jackson's character like that's the bad slave, and then you look at Jamie Foxx's character like that's the good slave. It's we never like really uncovered the layers of oh well maybe why are they this way? Like we just never really look at the humanity of it, I guess, in my opinion. Like while I was like growing up in school, and it was just always the same basics. And I'm just wondering what is it going to take for us to finally truly be educated on the history of slavery? And trauma theory seems like it's a great way to look at it.
I think part of what's unnerving about, for me, about listening to you talk about this is that that neo-slave narratives or contemporary narratives of slavery are in many senses written to undermine the phenomenon that you're talking about, right? So neo-slave narratives prior to interpretation through the lens of trauma theory, right, just sort of on their own, are intended to lend complexity to both our sense of history as it was and our sense of our relationship as sort of inheritors of this system of social organization to that past, right? And if you look at a book like Beloved, for example, certainly Toni Morrison radically problematizes the idea that there were only heroic or insolent slaves, right? Or the idea that that the end of slavery was in any uncomplicated way only triumphant, right? So I'm not sure, I'm not confident that trauma theory is sort of the missing educational piece, right? That's going to make this sort of crystallize and click for a public audience. And I wonder, relatedly, about how sort of the non-literary may in fact be more useful as a pedagogical tool for audiences that, for sort of mass audiences that have in many ways proved resistant to literary trends, right? So some of the things that I'm thinking of when I talk about the non-literary are museum exhibits, tours of historical sites, right? I'm reluctant to say reenactments because I think that comes with a whole other, host of problems. But I wonder if there are ways in which we can think about performance and art and installation processes as perhaps supplementing and more aggressively or effectively ushering people into the kinds of engagements and productive discomforts that we need them to have.
Hi,
Erica.
It's good to see you again. So I have a two-part question. The first is related to, I guess, gendered aspects of your research, because in both of the studies that you presented, they both have female protagonists. Right. And so I'm wondering if you have explored texts that have had male protagonists, and whether or not there is a difference in how the fantasy is presented, what the purpose or the desire is, and who's controlling that.
Sure.
And then also how these texts relate to Black literary postmodernism, specifically Jameson, but any other interpretations. Because I was in your class, so I'm interested in like how this fits. That was like two semesters ago, something. But so I'm interested in how this fits into the postmodernism narrative, and then gendered aspects.
Okay, I can do that. Okay, so first the gendered aspects. Yes, I do read books by men. I'm kidding. And I do think that there are ways in which one could make an argument that there are sort of to some degree, calcified gendered differences between contemporary narratives of slavery that are male-authored and female-authored. I don't think this holds true to the text, but to give you an example, Beloved's fantasy is a fantasy of matrilineal reconnection, right? It's about the idea of a ghosted child who comes back to the mother, and Sethe says, "You came back like a good girl, like a good daughter," right? So by contrast, if we look at a book like David Bradley's The Chaney'sville Incident, right, which is a book about a black male historian who, as he's confronting the sort of fact of his father's death and sort of the dying out of his paternal line, takes on this research project in order to understand his sort of place in connection with a sort of patrilineal line of descent. And in doing so, he uncovers the sort of fact of his traditional African cosmology, which tells him that, in fact, his ancestors have never died, right? That death is a fiction of the European and Euro-American worlds, and that the ghosts of his forefathers are still roaming the wilderness, seeking out revenge, right? So I think this is a text that we can juxtapose kind of in obvious ways against something like Beloved, right? We can say not only here he's interested in patrilineal remembrance and Morrison is interested in matrilineal remembrance. We can also say more sort of borderline offensive essentialist things like Morrison's interested in the mystical and the bodily, and Bradley is interested in the sort of cerebral and the they're like all the patrilineal line is they're all hunters, and so I mean, I would be hesitant to sort of ossify these things into rules about how men and women write narratives about slavery, but I think certainly dimensions of their sort of cultural experience of both who they are and what their relationship to a racial past is are inflected by gender, and we see that in obvious and subtle ways in different texts. So that's that. In terms of the question about Black literary postmodernism, right? What I would propose to you is that in returning to this sort of genealogy of African American cultural consciousness that I've proposed, that we could relate the idea of the secondary rupture, the idea of the crisis in faith, or the sort of political demoralization that follows Black liberation movements of the 20th century as a postmodern phenomenon, right? Postmodernism dealing in general with skepticism or cynicism toward large explanatory rubrics through which we make sense of the world and our place in them, right? So certainly the idea of what folks like Cornel West have called the crisis in Black leadership, right, could be seen as one strain of the postmodern experience for African Americans.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm not sure where the question is in this, so I'm just going to talk it out.
Go for it.
And figure it out.
Maybe we'll just learn.
Yeah. And I was thinking about this in terms of persons in America in the Black diaspora who weren't. So I'm thinking specifically first generation Americans, and who sort of imagine this fantasy of home that actually exists.
Right.
And so Audre Lorde's biomythography Zami, and this place that has bases in a real temporal as well, in existence. And it's also connected to and I think this goes back to individual desire. And I'm first generation American, so this is probably just all about me. But what really stood out to me in your presentation were concepts of lost and home, and feeling lost and looking for home, and how I'll go to Jamaica and still not feel home necessarily. And I went to Ghana and I went to the slave forts, and it's still not being home. Like it's a ruptured connection
Right.
of identity. And I'm just wondering, what are the risks of looking for home and looking for catharsis and repair in fantasy and through time and through space? And I'm slightly worried that so much Black literature is focused on this, because I'm wondering if there's not another way for repair.
Yeah, I think that's a concern that some folks share. My sense is that it's less prevalent within literary communities than it is in, say, the domain of politics or even of political philosophy, right? Where people like Wendy Brown have expressed powerful cynicism about the idea that looking backwards rather than looking forwards, right? That looking for repair rather than looking for freedom should constitute the sort of primary political desire of marginalized people. I buy that in a lot of ways. I also don't know what one does with the desire that persists, right? So it's one thing to say it's not productive, or it doesn't work in our political interests to feel these things, to feel this yearning that's irresolvable. But I'm not sure that does something to the desire, right? And I think that one of the things that literary production has been somewhat successful in doing has been in fantasizing resolutions to unresolved histories, right? So Beloved is this wrenchingly painful book to read, right? But it actually ends with this moment of sort of human connection and optimism that allows for some kind of resolution, right? And I wonder if that might be one thing that makes it safer to, say, look to the past via literature than look to the past via a sort of pilgrimage to Africa or something, right? And there's actually, so we didn't get to talk much about Africa as sort of a third potential site of origins, but one of the interesting things about contemporary narratives of slavery is that Africa figures very minorly within them. At the same time, there's been a recent proliferation of personal memoir about African Americans traveling back to Africa and experiencing this return as a kind of non-return, right? As a sort of jarring moment of misrecognition or being unrecognized, that's in many ways radically dissimilar from earlier representations of pilgrimages home, right? Like Alex Haley's or Maya Angelou's, who talk about returning to West Africa and being recognized by their ethnic groups, right? Instead, we see in something like, I don't know if you know Saidiya Hartman's memoir, Lose Your Mother. She talks about this research trip that she takes back to Ghana and how growing up in the 70s, she had sort of internalized these cultural fantasies about Africa as her place of origins and as a sort of site of longed for reclamation, and then she goes there and feels totally foreign and out of place, right? So those are the kinds of narratives that we're getting now about diasporic return that are in many ways different from, if not sort of antagonistic toward, the kinds of narratives that novels of slavery are trying to tell. Thanks.
Oh, hey, how's it going?
Hi.
So I was interested in something you said in response to Natalie's question when you were talking about non-literal interpretations, and I was wondering about I guess kind of the strengths of like comparing and crashing the strengths of something that's supposed to be that's factual and something that's supposed to be more like representative in like a more visceral sense or well, fiction anyway. And I was wondering like maybe what the strengths and weaknesses for those types of stories were, and like different like what their places were, or like how to understand them, and how they come together, I guess.
What do you mean by how they come together?
Or like if in an understanding or discussion, I guess I'm kind of making assumptions here. So like, do you feel like there's a place for both of them and an advantage for both of them, and if so, what is it, and how can they both like come together? So when I say come together,
Got
you know,
it.
like.
Okay, got it. Thanks. I appreciate. Okay, so I guess maybe a good place to start would be by saying that we've progressed far enough chronologically that there have been several generations of novels about slavery that aren't slave narratives, but that are like late 20th and early 21st century productions, right? And the sort of conventional wisdom is that the first generation of contemporary novels of slavery, which the first neo-slave narrative is generally, that status is generally attributed to Margaret Walker's novel Jubilee, which came out in 1966. So late 60s, early 70s, historical realism is the norm, right? And what authors of this generation are generally interested in doing is recuperating lost historical truths, right? Their productivity comes on the heels of a sort of monumental shift in studies of the history of slavery, during which the historical, the written testimony and the written and oral testimony of formerly enslaved African Americans is credited and validated for the first time in the history of the study of slavery, right? So gaining access to all of these new primary documents, this first generation of African American authors takes on the project of assimilating a first-person story of slavery into the cultural consciousness, right? It's after that generation that we start to see more experimentation, and the experimentation can take all sorts of forms, right? Beloved, as we've seen, is one kind of experimental writing that even as it's sort of stylistically and thematically unconventional and daring, still works in the service of evoking and showing what we might call emotional truths about the past, right? So part of what Morrison's project is to put us in the place of historical experience, right? To make us feel the various terrible things that enslaved African Americans felt, right? So we feel in the passage that we looked at, the sort of wrenching discomfort and disorientation of being in the hold of a slave ship, or we feel through sympathy the sort of the psychic pain that accompanies the impossible choice of killing your child or sending them back to slavery, right? So she has these investments in reproducing historical feeling for us in a contemporary era. That's not the project of someone like Charles Johnson or Ishmael Reed, right? Satirists of slavery, who aren't satirists in the sense that they're trying to make light of slavery as an institution. But I think that part of what they're trying to do is to make the stories of slavery available to reappropriation, to recirculation, to make them available for use for our contemporary moment, right? So maybe it would be helpful to think of this by way of analogy. That like when we appropriate a term, or when we reappropriate a term, right? So say the term black, right? When we reappropriated the term black in the 1970s and said that black is no longer going to be the verbal sign of disparagement and degradation, instead it's going to be a sign of beauty and power, right? That this was about re-engaging with a hurtful term in order to change its meaning, to change the ways in which it circulated in society, right? And I think one of the things that people are often trying to do when they write sort of subversive or generically unexpected stories about slavery is to make the sort of seemingly permanent wound of those historical stories seem less fixed, right? Seem more malleable, more susceptible or vulnerable to the ways in which we can turn it into story. And I think that that's both an exciting and a dangerous project, right? There are ways in which that can go terribly wrong. And there are ways in which it may feel or prove liberating and exciting.
Okay, we're coming to a close, and I just wanted to ask you, did you want to continue with questions, or
Are there other questions?
Okay, great. Everyone, please give a round of applause.
I'm also happy to, should other questions or comments or concerns come up, I'm happy to respond to emails or to meet with folks who'd be interested in continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much.